This is Rob Bierregaard, and I'm known to many of you on the chat group as Dr. B. And I've been studying ospreys since 1971. And this was when I climbed into my first osprey nest on Martha's Vineyard, when there were 2 pairs of ospreys on Martha's Vineyard. This was at the nadir of the DDT-related osprey population crash. There are now, last year there were 100 pairs of ospreys on Martha's Vineyard. So ospreys have made a great comeback around the world. As any of you would know if you have read Alan Poole's great new book about the revival of ospreys around the world. So I started working with ospreys in 1971 and took an 8-year interlude to run off to Brazil and run a research project down there, where I saw an occasional osprey, but didn't do any research with them. I came back, and when I got back in the about 1990, I got back into working with birds of prey, and then started seriously doing some more osprey research on Martha's Vineyard following that population as it recovered from DDT, and then starting my research with satellite tracking osprey migration. And from 2000 to 2017, my colleagues and I put satellite radios on 108 ospreys. And those birds were tagged anywhere from South Carolina all the way up to Newfoundland in Canada. So we're going to start off. I've got a list of questions that Regina from the chat group and Candace from Explore have forwarded to me. They're both questions and sort of topics to talk about. So I will jump in, and the first question that on the list here is actually not about what happens at the nest, but what happens when ospreys are heading down to South America for their migration. So if we can pull those slides up, I've got a series of maps we're going to look at that will explain what happens. Ospreys, people, myself included, often joke, go on separate vacations, the adults, and that explains why they can mate for life. And the females head down to leave the nest area around the middle of August for birds in the Northeast. So the young at that point have been on the wing for 2 or 3 weeks, and the adult males are stick around for another 2 or 3 weeks to provision the young. I hear a lot of people talking about the adult ospreys teaching their young to hunt. They really don't. All the adult ospreys do is provide their young with an allowance. They provide fish at the nest while the young are off following their instincts and learning by trial and error how to catch fish, which they typically do within a week to 10 days. They've usually caught their first fish, and it doesn't take them much longer to become independent and take off and start to explore the world. Some young birds will hang around the nest until the day they migrate. We had a bird in New Hampshire that hadn't been farther from her nest than 1/3 of a mile until the day she took off and headed to South America. And then we've had, on the other hand, a young bird from Martha's Vineyard named Meadow, who left Martha's Vineyard and wandered all the way to Lake Superior, over 1,000 miles before, and settled down there for 3 weeks before, actually for 2 months before she started migrating. So once they do start migrating, they stay over land as much as possible. They don't like to, strangely enough, for a bird that only eats water, only eats fish, they don't like to fly over long distances of open water, and that's because they can't land on the water and float. In fact, if you think about it, if an osprey could float, that would be pretty counterproductive, since the osprey has to go underwater to catch its fish. So they head south, and they wind up, all the East Coast birds and even some of the Midwest birds get funneled down to the Florida Keys, and they jump over to, from the Florida Keys to Cuba. They go down Cuba. There we go. So this map, the white lines, I hope they're better image than I'm seeing on your screens. But you can see the general path there, that the main sort of river of ospreys goes to the Florida Keys, then Cuba, and then over to Hispaniola. And you notice that almost all of them head south, just about the middle of Hispaniola. and a couple of birds go out all the way to Puerto Rico, and then they head south, and they spread out across South America. Some of them get as far south as Argentina. So if we can see the next slide. These are the juveniles, and notice the pronounced difference between the juveniles and the adults. Lots of things going on here. That one line that goes off into the Atlantic is a bird from New Hampshire who got stuck in a ship, or didn't get stuck on a ship, but he landed on a ship in some bad weather and then didn't get off. 7 days later, we lost him out over the open water somewhere. But the big thing to notice here is all those young ospreys that are heading south from New England out over the Atlantic, and no adult, if you remember from the slide before, no adult does that. So we'll also see a lot of young going south from Cuba across the longest part of the Caribbean. There's a little bit of a stream going south from Hispaniola where almost all the adults go. And then you see that most of the juveniles don't know when it's time to turn south. So they go all the way to the eastern end of the Dominican Republic. And when they run out of land, that's when they go south. So look at the next slide. We can see these are where satellite tag birds have settled down. So you can see that they're spread out over a pretty broad portion of South America and up into Central America and Mexico as well. The birds that you see in Mexico and Central America are mostly birds from the Pacific Northwest. Very few of them make it all the way to South America. You also notice a bit of a difference that the purple colors are females, and they tend to go a little further south than the males that are teal or aqua or whatever color that is. So they spread out and they settle down. And one of the things we've learned from the satellite tagging is that the adults go back to the exact same spot. Almost every adult goes back to the exact same spot every year. And that makes sense because if it ain't broke, don't fix it strategy. If that spot got you through last winter, why go looking for another one? So we see them going back in the next slide. We'll see, this is North Fork Bob. This is an adult male we tagged on Long Island, on the North Fork of Long Island in 2010. And these are two of his round trips. You notice that in one year he landed in Venezuela, and the next year he landed in Colombia, but he still found his way to exactly the same bend in the Ventuari River in southern Venezuela. Next slide shows us how small an area an adult osprey can be. This is an oxbow lake near the Amazon River, in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. And you notice there's a scale down there. So that bird for 5 months barely moved more than 3 miles in any direction during that 5-month period. So adults, when they get to South America, tend to be there's a very low mortality rate in the adults because they're going back to a safe place that they've been to many years in the past, and they settle down and then turn around and come back in February or March. So the next shot, which I think is so this shows 3 different young birds. And you can see, hopefully, where there's a little dot and a label, that's where the bird finally settled down. But notice how much the birds wandered around exploring. They'll get to a spot, settle down for 3 weeks or so, and then they'll go on these big looping peregrinations, if an osprey can peregrinate. Sort of exploring, looking to see if the grass is greener or the ponds are fishier on the other side of the next ridge. And they finally settle down. Rarely are they not settled down by January or February of the year they go south. And the next slide, and I think that's the last one, we're going to see. So this is Belle, the heroine, although it turns out Belle should have been named Beau. So Belle was an osprey we tagged on Martha's Vineyard in 2010, and that on the left you see the first trip south. This is the clearing is in Rondonia, which is just south of the Amazon rainforest. And you'll notice that she did just what those other birds we saw on the previous slide did. They find a spot and then they wander around. And then she finally, by 4 or 5 months after she had arrived, she had settled down to one spot. And if the map on the right is her entire second winter, and you see that she just found one spot that she liked, and every year after all of the subsequent migrations, she went to the exact same spot and barely moved at all. So Belle is the bird I wrote my first kids book, Belle's Journey, about, which is a kids book written for ages 8 to 108, available at your local bookstores. Get in touch with me if you want a signed copy. But that tells the story of Belle's travels. And one of the cool things that Belle taught us was that, and we could figure this out if you remember the slides of the adults and the juvenile migrations, and the adults clearly know where they're going, and the young birds obviously don't when they head south. That's why they're spread out across the Atlantic and crossing the Caribbean at the longest point possible. So what's going on there is that they have that proves to us they don't have a map of a set of instructions to go to point A, turn left, and go certain distance, and then turn right, and so on. They simply are following their beaks south. Instinct tells them to go south, tells them to stay over water if they can. And so young ospreys born on Martha's Vineyard go south, they get to the South Beach, and there's nothing but ocean. So then the command in their little brain that says go south takes over, and they fly across 1,200 miles of the Atlantic, nonstop. They can't stop and rest. So the longest trip we had a bird make over the Atlantic was a young bird from Newfoundland, Virginia, who left Newfoundland and flew 2,300 miles over the Atlantic. And I think it was 83 hours that she was in the air. So there you can see that particular trip from Newfoundland isn't in this map, but you can see those trips, those birds going way out over the ocean. So then what happens when the birds come north is they follow the same little algorithm, but this time it's go north and stay over land. And if they do that, they wind up, instead of going back over the Atlantic, they go through the Bahamas and then up the East Coast, and they get back to their nest. And the next year they know they don't have to go over the Atlantic, so they go back down the coast. And when we looked at Belle's first 4 migration cycles, we could see every year that she got better and better, and she finally figured out exactly what the adult route was. And it wasn't because of anything any instinct she had in her, other than these very simple rules of go south and stay over land. And nature loves the simple explanation for things. So whenever you have a very complicated explanation for something in nature or natural history, you're probably wrong. Hang on a sec. So I mentioned that adult ospreys have a very low mortality rate when they are down in South America. Juveniles, in contrast, have a pretty high mortality rate once they get across the Caribbean. And that's because they're wandering around so much. And all that wandering just increases the chances that they're going to get in trouble, which usually is related to humans. So that's a pretty good overview of what happens with osprey migration. One point I didn't mention, which most of you know, is that when young birds go down south in their first fall, the next spring they don't come back. They do a gap year. They spend actually about 18 months down in South America, or wherever they winter. Some birds will winter in Florida, Cuba, Mexico, wherever. So wherever they go, they don't come back the next spring. They spend an extra year. No one really understands that. Migration is a risky business, and ospreys don't typically start breeding until they're 3 years old anyway, and that's a very young age for an osprey to breed. So the sort of simple explanation is why risk it if you're not going to breed anyway? They spend that extra time down in South America. I thought originally, and this was one of the things that I wanted to learn by tagging the young ospreys, I thought that extra time in South America might be a way for them to sort of shop the real estate market and really look around to make sure that they had a good, safe spot with a lot of fish, which they would return to every year in all of their subsequent migrations. Well, it turned out that's not the case, because all of the birds that survive young birds that survive migration settle down within 4 or 5 months of getting there. So that extra time doesn't gain them anything. All it does is reduce their chance of dying on a needless migration. So now we're going to focus in on what happens around the nest. And the first question here is, do chicks fall out of nests occasionally? They do. It's rare, but it does happen. And most often it will happen when, and this is a topic we're going to talk about in a bit, because of sibling aggression. There is a hierarchy. So birds get pushed out of the nest. Sometimes rarely is it intentional, but it can be that one of the young is being aggressive toward its nestmate, and it just drives it backwards and off the edge of the nest. I don't like to put too much thought into the minds of animals, and so I don't want to think that this young osprey said, I'm going to kick this bird out of the nest, but all the bird did was follow its instincts, which was to assert its role in the dominance hierarchy, and sometimes that winds up in pushing a young out of the nest. So I'm going to jump ahead in my outline there, because that leads us into the whole question of sibling aggression and hatching synchrony, or asynchrony rather, and what's going on in the nest. So ospreys almost always lay 3 eggs. Probably 95% of osprey nests have 3 eggs, and occasionally they have 4. Sometimes they'll have 2 or 1, but those 2 or 1 nests are probably either young birds or very old birds who are getting, and very old in an osprey is in the late teens, early 20s. The oldest known osprey in the wild was an adult female in Scotland, who lived for 27 years, raised 50, fledged 50 young over the 27 years, and went through 6 or 7 males, which always gets a chuckle out of the audience, especially the women. And that makes a little bit of sense, because the males are doing almost all the hunting for the family. Sometimes if an osprey nest overlooks the water, we'll see the female hunt from the nest. We see Rachel on Hog Island. She'll occasionally just drop off the nest and plop into the water, talons first, of course, and snatch a little mackerel or something and bring it back to the nest. But as a rule, the male does all the hunting. So the female does the drudgery work of keeping the eggs warm, and then the chicks warm when it's cold, and dry when it's raining, and shaded when it's hot. So it's little surprise that by the middle of August, she says, I'm out of here. See you guys in March, or see you, Dad, in March. So the 3 eggs are laid, and typically the female will not incubate, or at least not incubate hard when she lays the first egg. So that embryo is sitting there, and it's at room temperature, if you will, at ambient temperature. And the embryo won't start to develop until the female sits on it, lies down on it, and incubates it and warms it up. So that she usually does that after she's laid the second egg. So the second egg and the first egg, the embryos typically begin developing at about the same time. Maybe the first egg has a day advantage. But typically those 2 eggs will hatch fairly short, with a fairly short time span. Then the 3rd egg is laid, and by the time the 3rd egg is laid, and this could be anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6 days after the first 2 eggs have been laid. Once that egg is laid, the female is already incubating. So as soon as the egg is laid, the embryo will start to develop, but the first 2 eggs have a 3 or 4 or 5 day head start. So they'll hatch first. And young birds double their size in just a matter of a few days. So with a 4 or 5 day head start, this last hatched young will often be a lot smaller than the first 2. And if the first one happens to be a female and the second one a male, the females are bigger, so that first one will be even bigger. And that sets up an advantage for the oldest hatched young, because when the adults come into the nest, they just feed the most active, they feed the first thing they see. So they come into the nest, and the oldest young, here we see that the bigger young is on the left. So that one probably hatched before the one on the right. And this is, so there's the egg that didn't hatch. So this looks like this is Rachel feeding the two young on Hog Island. And so that in this case, there's a lot of food. So the bird on the left, the young doesn't even seem very hungry. So the female is feeding the one that's most active. And what will happen is the larger young will get fed first until he or she can't feed anymore. And then the little one gets a chance. So in that, while there's plenty of food around, and this happens, of course, the same thing would happen if there were 3 or 4 young. So if there's not much food, if there's plenty of food to go around, the first young gets stuffed and can't eat anymore. And it's actually funny to watch the females who just want to feed their young. And one of my students was watching a nest where the young was stuffed and the female still had some fish to feed. And the young just couldn't eat anymore. And the Jennifer said that the young osprey yawned, and as soon as the mother osprey saw the open mouth, she stuffed a piece of fish in it. It's pretty cute. So the first young gets fed until it can't eat anymore, then the second one, then the third. And if there's plenty of food to go around, then all of the young will eventually get fed and survive. But if it's a bad year for fish, which happens not infrequently, then the first young will get the first fish that comes in, and there might not be another fish for a while. And the second and third young perhaps didn't get much out of that first fish. And by the time another fish comes in, the big and older young is hungry again. So that bird will get fed again before the other two. And within a short period of time, we can see that one of the young will starve to death, which is really tough to watch. And that's one of the downsides of these wonderful nature cams that give us a glimpse into the natural world around us. Sometimes so much that we forget that we should go out and be in the natural world ourselves. It's tempting to just sit and watch nest cams all day long. I'm guilty of that, as a lot of you are. So when we watch these difficult and heartbreaking scenarios play out, we have to remember that this is the way it works for a reason. And so because of that hierarchy, and the hierarchy can be established or accentuated by the oldest bird pecking literally creating a pecking order by biting and nipping at its siblings. And sometimes they'll actually kill the younger birds. I watched one young go over, and that was a really tough one to watch in Long Island, where the smallest bird could barely lift its head up, and the older one went over and bit it in the neck, and that was it for that young osprey. So what happens in that situation is there's only enough food for one young osprey, and the one dominant osprey gets enough food to fledge, and the other two starve. If all 3 eggs had hatched on the same day, and they were all the same size, and they all had the equal sort of place, there was no hierarchy, then enough fish for one osprey would be divided between 3 ospreys, and none of them would survive. So that hatching asynchrony and the dominance hierarchy that's established by the older and larger young aggressively occasionally attacking, and bunking is the term that sometimes is used on the Hog Island chat group. By setting that up, that is an insurance policy that at least if there's enough food for one young, at least one young will fledge. And we have to remember that if you look at a colony of ospreys, the average number of young that fledge out of an osprey nest is less than 2. More often it's closer to 1. And since we know that almost all nests start out with 3 eggs, that in almost every nest, 1 or more young are going to die. And we don't always know why. Sometimes we've learned from the nest cams that there's a lot more predation going on with great horned owls and bald eagles than we had known about before. Obviously, the mortality due to great horned owls is something that we would rarely know about. Although people have gone into osprey nests and found a dead adult osprey in the nest that was pretty clearly killed by a great horned owl. So we see this mortality, and it's part of the way the osprey species has evolved. It's the way the world works. I often read on comments on chat lines that nature is cruel, and I think I've beaten this little mantra into most of the osprey group on Hog Island, that nature isn't cruel. Because being cruel implies that you're doing evil or harm for harm's sake. And that's not what happens in nature. Nature is harsh. It's very often random, and it's unforgiving. It's usually wonderful, but it's never cruel. So that's something that I hope that's a take-home message you can, if I haven't already drilled that into your head. I actually had a little girl at a book signing come up to me and read and recite that little saying to me. So that was pretty cool. So that's what happens at nests with the hierarchy, the dominance that is set up by the asynchronous hatching and the built-in aggression that osprey young have toward their smaller young. And there are a lot of nests where you see very little aggression at all, and those typically are the nests that where there's plenty of food to go around. And sometimes fish will pile up in the nest, coming in faster than the young can feed it. And at those nests, you rarely are going to see any aggression. So there's been one of the questions is about what happens why do eggs not hatch? And that's pretty much a mystery. Could be they weren't fertilized. There's a fairly narrow window when the way that egg is formed. The yolk develops in the female osprey's ovary, and so the yolk develops, and that's where all the food that the young osprey is going to survive on while it's in the egg for 37 or 38 or 39 days. So all that energy is packed into the yolk. It takes the female a while to develop that, and the egg is sort of sitting on a membrane around the unfertilized egg is on the outside of that yolk sac. So that the yolk ruptures from its oocyte in the ovary and drops down at the head of the oviduct, and then that's where fertilization takes place. Then that yolk with presumably now the fertilized egg attached to the yolk sac begins to pass down the oviduct, and a series of glands lay down the egg white first, and then as the egg goes down the oviduct, another set of glands lay down. There are two membranes that go around the egg white, and you know those because when you peel a hard-boiled egg, if you're lucky, you crack the egg and all of a sudden all of the shell will peel off, and that little membrane that's connecting all of the pieces of your eggshell are connected by those membranes. And then another set of glands lays down the actual eggshell itself, calcium carbonate. And that was where DDT got messed up the osprey's reproductive system. It made the eggshells, the females couldn't laid eggshells that were too thin. And we've all heard about osprey eggs, actually, and peregrines and bald eagles, other birds that were affected by DDT. We've heard about eggshells actually cracking under the weight of the incubating female. Well, the osprey young were having problems hatching long before the shells got so thin that they were breaking under the weight of the incubating female. Osprey, the embryo, an avian embryo inside that egg, is metabolizing the energy from the yolk. So it's actually breathing. It needs oxygen and it needs to get rid of carbon dioxide. Well, that happens through tiny, tiny pores in the eggshell. And as the eggshell, so there's a very delicate balance between oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out. When carbon dioxide goes out, water vapor also goes out. So when a bird egg actually loses weight during the period of time where the embryo is developing in it because of this water loss. If the eggshell is too thin, the size of the pores and that whole delicately balanced equation of how much oxygen is coming in, how much carbon dioxide and water or vapor are going out is thrown off, and the young are unlikely to hatch. So just doesn't take much thinning, about 13 or 14% thinning, and then the embryos begin to have a hard time hatching. So we don't believe that's what's going on here. There's DDT is pretty much gone from our ecosystem. There are other chemicals that we're monitoring. There's a flame retardant chemical that people are concerned about. But I don't think this is a situation where there's any pollution. But we are monitoring. I use the term "we" very loosely. There are scientists, other scientists who are taking blood samples from ospreys and keeping that as sort of a reference collection. We learned our lesson from the osprey peregrine DDT issue. So we're using ospreys as a sentinel species because they're so easy to get our hands onto, and it's easy to take blood samples. We may collect the egg when I go up on next week to the nest at Hog Island to band the young. I'll probably pull the egg down, and we may save that for chemical analysis. But it's more likely that the egg was infertile than there was any sort of chemical problem. We don't think it was, or it's unlikely to have anything to do with bad weather because 2 of the 3 eggs hatched. And osprey eggs, this is one really cool thing we learned from a nest down in Chesapeake a couple of years ago. And this was pretty far into the incubation period. The female there left the nest and was gone for, I think, 10 hours. And it was a cold, windy, rainy day, temperature in the 40s. And those eggs were left unattended for 10 hours. And I was amazed that the eggs hatched. I had thought that, I know that you can take a fertile egg out from underneath a chicken, saying you can pop it in the fridge for a month and it'll be fine. If you put it underneath a brooding chicken or incubating chicken, the embryo will start to develop, and that's fine. So I knew that about eggs, but I didn't know that you could interrupt even that with an embryo that was already developing, that they could interrupt the process and get chilled down to that degree and still survive. So probably not a problem with incubation or weather, probably not anything chemical. And I think there are, between the 3 nests that are on the explore.org cams, I think there are total of 5 eggs that didn't hatch. I think my guess is that's just a random, that's the way it happened this year, but something to keep our eyes on. So that leads into I've just sort of answered one of the questions is, what's the impact of bad weather conditions on courtship and incubation? Probably not much on courtship. Maybe if the weather is really bad, we have had some years on the vineyard and over on Westport River where it's just been a really awful spring with nor'easter after nor'easter and terrible weather. And in those cases, one year we lost more than half of the clutches on the island. So really bad weather can certainly have an effect on incubation and reduce the success rate for a colony. But we have to remember that ospreys typically will breed for 5, 6, maybe as much as, in that case of our bird over in Scotland, he was probably breeding for 25 years. That, of course, is way out at the end of the bell curve. But I've trapped 2 or 3 ospreys at nests that were the females where they were 19 or 20, 21 years old. So ospreys can live and breed for a long time. So 1 or 2 seasons where they lose their clutch is totally insignificant. Now, if it happens again and again, like it did in the era of DDT, there were years when there were 25 pairs of ospreys on Great Island at the mouth of the Connecticut River, and there were years where they fledged 0 young. And obviously that population couldn't support that for very long. Predators and other threats to the nest. The nest cams are really teaching us things about ospreys and the behavior of other birds and wildlife that we really didn't know about. So some of you who are really avid followers of these webcams have probably watched, no, not probably, I know you've watched more osprey behavior than I have. And I turned to you and I asked for questions, and when we revised the Birds of North America chapter on ospreys a few years ago, there were, so I leaned on the Hog Island community and asked them to follow some things. They looked at hatch dates. There were 4 or 5 bits of information in the Osprey account for the Birds of North America project that are directly came from the Hog Island chat group. And I thank you for that. So you're all excellent citizen scientists. So one of the things, as I said, we've learned a lot, but we didn't know about ospreys from these cams. And the extent to which great horned owls are playing a role as predators to ospreys is pretty much new. So we knew that happened some, but we didn't know quite as much as it does. And great horned owls actually are not a threat only to young ospreys. I've had probably 5 or 6 of my adult or fully fledged ospreys on the wing migrating north or south fly into a woodlot to spend the night and not come out the other end. And I call this death by woodlot, and it's almost certainly great horned owls. So great horned owls are about the most ferocious avian predator there is. I've even seen clips of a great horned owl attacking an adult bald eagle in a nest, which is really amazing. So bald eagles are a threat, as we've seen, unfortunately, at the Hog Island nest. We've lost a couple of young to bald eagles, and I'm frankly surprised that we haven't seen that more often, because a nest full of young ospreys sitting out in a tree in the middle of, or at the edge of Muscongas Bay is pretty much, to me, seems like a little hors d'oeuvre tray for bald eagles flying by. And I think we're seeing, the only places we're seeing osprey numbers go down a bit is where bald eagle numbers are really going up. And I think what happened is that because ospreys have a shorter generation span than bald eagles, they start breeding when they're 3 or 4, and bald eagles not until they're 5 or 6. So ospreys recovered faster from DDT, and I think they filled in areas where bald eagles hadn't yet recovered. And so ospreys got a sort of a little window, which was pretty much bald eagle free. And now bald eagles numbers are catching up, and they're going up everywhere, just the way ospreys numbers did and still are. So ospreys are going to be under more and more pressure from bald eagles. And this may explain some of the situations where ospreys get in a pretty colonial situation. Gardiner's Island, which is an island of about 5 to 10 square miles in Long Island Sound, had 300 pairs of ospreys on it before the DDT era. And the mouth of the Connecticut River, there is a small estuary island out in the estuary called Great Island, which has up to 30 osprey nests. And I think part of that, the advantage for ospreys nesting in those colonial situations is that they have really added defense against bald eagles. There's no bald eagle that's going to get close to that colony. If you have a lone osprey nest like we have at Hog Island with no other pair nearby, one of the adults may be out fishing and there's just one osprey nearby, and it may be not at the nest right when a bald eagle comes in to make a bit of a surprise attack and snatch a young. There's no way that can be avoided. If that happened at Great Island, where there are 30 pairs of ospreys, there's never going to be a time when there aren't going to be some ospreys sitting around doing nothing, and they will spot a bald eagle from miles away and not let it get near the nest. So there's certainly safety in numbers for ospreys in situations where bald eagle numbers are going up. And so maybe, hopefully, if a pair gets established on the boathouse at Hog Island and there are other pairs nearby, that would certainly decrease the chance of bald eagle predation in the nest. There's nothing we can do about the great horned owl situation other than what the crew at Hog Island is doing, which is the floodlight, which I think is a great idea. It gives takes away the surprise attack to some extent, the advantage that the great horned owls have by being able to come in at night under the cover of darkness and attack the nest. They're also, I think, Manny the manakin is going to be reappear beneath the nest. I'm not 100% convinced that did anything other than give folks some amusement in dressing up the mannequin, but it seemed to maybe it did help, and it certainly didn't hurt. So I'm all in favor of I will be meeting Manny for the first time coming up on Saturday. So other than that, we're the program, or the concept of how to deal with that nest is no intervention unless it's something that we can do simply, like put the floodlights on. But there's no, they would never trap the owl and try to remove it. We're simply going to watch what happens with nature, give the ospreys a bit of a chance with the extra light, and just cross our talons and hope for the best. So I will be, hopefully, if all goes well, I'm going to be up in that nest on probably Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. And I will move some sticks away from the camera, as Regina asked, that there's some sticks that are in the way, one of the low angle cameras. I'll also bring a paper towel and some Windex, because I don't know, sure if this year, if they've been pooping on the lens, but sometimes I need to clean that lens off when I get up there. So I'll be doing that Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. We talked about non-viable eggs, sibling rivalry talked about. When do female ospreys stop breeding? Avian menopause, if you will. They'll go on as long as they can, and their reproductive rate does tend to drop off when ospreys get into their mid to late teens, but they'll still keep cranking them out. And as I said, there was a 27-year-old that was raising young to her last year up in Scotland, and I've tagged banded two or three adult females who were breeding at 20 or 21 years old. Steve showed some unusual aggressive behavior towards Rachel in the aftermath of some interloper activities. Still in adrenaline shock? ? That's probably what happened. And if we remember back to the great horned owl attack last year on the young at the Hog Island nest, Rachel, after she drove the great horned owl out of the nest, started attacking her own young and almost knocked the last young out of the nest. And I think that was just total adrenaline frenzy. And that's certainly what was going on. Um, the question about nest parasites, and this is the referring to the black flies in late spring, early summer at the Decorah bald eagle nest, with the young being taken to a rehab because of heavy flights. Could I elaborate a bit about nest and birds parasites? I'm not much of an expert on that, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but birds do have feather parasites, blood-sucking parasites, and there are one of my colleagues here at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia studies the parasites of birds, bird feathers, and there are parasites that are specific to individual species, and so there's a whole world of avian insect parasites that I don't know much about, but it's out there. As a rule, it doesn't seem to be a big problem for ospreys. I don't ever remember hearing of any problems. Bot flies can be an issue. I've seen that in ospreys. I suppose it could. But so I don't know much about that, so I'm going to let that one slide. Sleep patterns of ospreys. Now we're getting to lots of things I don't know anything about. Some birds can sleep one side of their brain and not the other, and rest. So one side of the brain is awake and the other side is asleep. And this is birds that are migrating for days on end are probably doing this. I think it's been demonstrated that when swifts are circling at night, the eye on the outside of the circle is the one that's attached to the side of the brain that's awake, which makes sense. So that's probably that when we watch Rachel in the nest and she's aware of what's going on around her. And it may be that she is doing that, sleeping half of her brain while the other half is awake. Osprey pellets, indigestible bone parts, consumed nest material. I guess this is just a topic. Birds of prey have a sort of an expandable pouch at the very top of their stomach, really, and that is where they will, when they eat a big meal, you'll actually see this swelling right under their throat. And so they will pack in a whole bunch of food and slowly digest it. And the parts that can't be digested, bones and fur and feathers and scales, will get coughed up in a pellet. And those are, some of you probably played with those. We're going to do that at Hog Island. We have a bunch of pellets from snowy owls that we're going to, and other owls that we will dissect. And it's a way to see what the birds are eating. And it's a way that the birds don't pass all of that roughage on through their system. Don't see it very often in ospreys. I think they can digest quite a bit of the bones, but I know that from personal experience that birds can control how much calcium they digest. So I've had a number of falcons and hawks that I trained when I was active in falconry way back in my graduate school days. And I remember watching my prairie falcon eat the same amount of bones, and one day casts up a pellet with no bones in it, and the next day, or the next week maybe, cast up a pellet with a lot of bones. So it really seemed that they could control how much, when they know they need calcium, they can crank up some enzyme in their crop and gives it crop to digest more bone than not. Owls typically don't digest very much at all, which is why owl pellets are so much fun to digest. And the other thing that makes owl pellets easy to work with is that owls typically will, when they eat small prey, they will eat the whole thing, swallow it whole. We have a very amusing osprey, snowy owl pellet up in the lab at Hog Island, and it was a muskrat that the snowy owl swallowed whole, and the pellet came up, and basically the muskrat is still intact. The feet were all in the right place, and the fur was heading in the right digestion. It was just everything had been digested out. So it was almost like an exoskeleton of an insect. Charlie on Charlot's nest copulated with Charlotte about 4 days ago. He was not rejected by her. In fact, I would call it a successful mating if we were still in the courtship period. Could it be a reaction to an interloper trying to land on the nest and perch only minutes prior to that, or rather bonding, showing that this lady is mine? I think that's probably the case. Ospreys will copulate way past the time that eggs have been laid, so there's no physiological reason for it. But it's all part of the hormonal balance. The hormones that drive copulation behavior are in the bird's systems well past the time that eggs are laid, and they don't. Those hormones don't instantly disappear, and the same sort of thing happens in the spring as birds are, and we see this in songbirds, to switch species a little bit, but the analogy is the same. And when you think about songbirds migrating north, the warblers that are heading far north. Okay, so I'm gonna close up in a couple of minutes. My birds migrating north are singing even though they're hundreds of miles from where they're going to nest. And that's simply because the hormones that drive them to sing and drive the whole breeding cycle are building up, and they're just responding to those hormonal levels. So I think that's what's going on with birds that are copulating after the eggs are already laid. I think to some extent it sort of explains the way that young birds of prey are weaned from their parents. The adults become less and less interested in feeding young as their hormonal levels go down, and that results in the adults just sort of flying near the nest with food and not going all the way to the nest, and that leads anxious young to go out chasing after their parents. And this is a lot of the when I hear people say that the birds are the adults are teaching the young to fly. I think they're not really doing that. They're just not that interested in going back to the nest, and they might get sort of beat up by the young in the nest anyway. So they just sort of fly near the nest, and the young come out to take the food. So that's pretty much all the questions, and we're running out of time since I got a late start. I thought I was 45 minutes early for this. It turns out I was 15 minutes late. Apologies for that. I hope you all have enjoyed the talk and have learned a few things. And I look forward to seeing some of you up on Hog Island in 4 or 5 days. So with that, I will sign off.